Widowed rancher finds an elderly woman trying to feed a skinny horse in the corral. Comment down below telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you like my story, and I'd love to get to know you better. So please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The wind was howling that morning when I spotted the small, hunched silhouette down by the corral. It was 5 in the morning. The sky hadn't yet decided between night and day, and the gale sweeping across the Texas plains kicked up swirling red dust devils that coated everything. The fence posts, the barbed wire, the twisted branches of the mesquite trees. I had a habit, carried over from my years in federal law enforcement, of walking the perimeter of the ranch first thing. Not out of necessity, out of muscle memory, out of not knowing what else to do with the silence of the empty house. And it was that wind, the same wind that muffled everything, that swallowed sounds and voices, that almost made me walk right past. But something about the way the figure stood caught my eye. An elderly woman, with snow-white hair and a slow, deliberate shuffle, was reaching out to the muzzle of a bone-thin horse, its ribs showing starkly under a dull coat, holding a handful of prairie grass in her trembling hand. The animal backed away. The woman stepped forward, and neither side seemed ready to give up. I walked closer. The woman didn't run, didn't even startle. She just turned her face. A face I didn't recognize, but one that carried a strange familiarity I couldn't quite place in that moment, and said with a calmness that didn't match the situation, "This horse belonged to my son." I froze. I didn't have kids, but I had a past that, much like that horse, had been left behind, starved and abandoned, waiting for someone to return. The woman's name was Martha. She was 72 years old, hailed from a small town about 25 miles away, and had arrived at my property on foot. A fact I'd only uncover later, because with an almost dangerous kind of innocence, she had accepted a ride from Arthur, a man who had unceremoniously dumped her on the shoulder of the highway, 2 miles from the ranch, claiming the rest of the way was easy to find. She did find it, but what she didn't know was that Arthur hadn't dropped her off by chance. He knew exactly where she was headed, and he knew why. Naturally suspicious and weathered by disappointment, I didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. I offered her water, because basic hospitality is the law out here on the plains, but I didn't invite her to sit. I asked her name. I asked what she wanted. And when she started talking, I felt the ground give way just a little beneath my boots. Martha was the mother of a man named Michael, and Michael had worked on this very ranch 23 years ago, back when the land still belonged to my father-in-law, before my wife passed away, before everything fell apart. Michael had passed away 6 months ago, from causes Martha described with a tight-lipped grief and careful words. And the only thing he had left behind in a black leather notebook, which he kept safely tucked inside a canvas tote bag, was the name of this ranch, and a single sentence: "The horse knows where the truth lies." I looked over at the emaciated horse in the pen. The animal had wandered onto the property alone 3 weeks prior, with no owner, no tags, no explanation. I'd thought about donating him to a rescue. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Over the next few days, I let Martha stay. Not out of the goodness of my heart, but because something I couldn't explain stopped me from sending her packing. She slept in the back bedroom, the exact same room where Michael had bunked decades ago, and every morning she was up before the sun to tend to the horse. The animal, which wouldn't let any of my guys near him, ate right out of her hand from day one. It was Alex, my oldest and most trusted ranch hand, who first pulled me aside with a grim look. "Boss, word about this strange woman hanging around the corral has already reached Arthur's ears." I knew Arthur. The whole county knew Arthur, a man with sprawling acreage and an ego to match, who for generations had viewed Michael's family as a stain on what he called the pure bloodline of the valley. There was a deep-seated feud between their families, buried in the dust, but far from dead. And Martha's arrival had stoked an ember Arthur had never truly let burn out. 3 days later, I woke up to find the corral gate busted open. The horse was still there, unharmed, but he was tied up differently, using a knot I recognized instantly, a specific slip knot used by border smugglers. Someone had paid a visit in the dead of night, and that someone had left a very clear, unspoken message. The internal struggle I'd been trying to bury for 4 years started to pound against my ribs. I was a man who had spent my life upholding the law, a federal agent for over a decade, who had turned in my badge after a botched operation by my superiors destroyed the lives of an innocent family. I had retreated to this ranch specifically to wash my hands of the world, to never try to save anyone again, to never fail anyone again. But Martha was right here, holding her handful of grass with her dangerous innocence, completely oblivious to the fact that she was walking into a minefield. During the second week, Richard, Arthur's younger brother and right-hand man, rolled up to the ranch with a wide smile and an offer. He wanted to buy the horse. I turned him down flat. Richard drove off without pushing the issue, which honestly felt far more threatening than if he had screamed in my face. Martha, who had overheard the exchange from the window, came downstairs with Michael's notebook and showed me a page she had been saving for the right moment. A hand-drawn map. Covered in markings I immediately recognized as geographical landmarks of my own land, and a spot marked with a bold X deep in a dense thicket of woods I had never bothered to explore. I knew I had to check that area out. But I also knew Arthur probably already knew about the notebook, because Martha, bless her trusting heart, had mentioned it to Chloe, the neighbor's daughter, without realizing that Chloe had been dating Arthur's nephew for months. The leak had sprung before I could even patch it. I spent that entire night staring at the ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of a choice I had sworn to never make again. I could just tell Martha to pack her bags, tell her this wasn't my fight, that I'd tried playing savior too many times, and it always ended in blood and tears. But every time I almost convinced myself, I pictured the gentle way she offered the horse that grass, the way the broken animal trusted her, the way she spoke of her son like he was still walking somewhere out there on this red earth. And deep down, I knew I wasn't going to turn her away, not this time. The third week kicked off with a legal notice delivered by a process server I didn't recognize. He hopped off a beat-up motorcycle, kept his helmet on, and shoved the manila envelope into my hands without meeting my eyes. Arthur had dug up some archaic legal loophole, a property dispute over the strip of land that bordered our 2 ranches, the exact same strip of land that provided direct access to the woods where Michael's ex marked the spot. Luke, the only neighboring rancher I actually considered a friend, showed up on my porch that afternoon, looking like he'd seen a ghost. John. This injunction landed on the desk of a substitute judge. The guy was partners at a law firm with Arthur's son-in-law about 10 years back. That's no coincidence. It wasn't. I knew that. Arthur didn't sneeze without planning 3 moves ahead, and he was trying to sweep me off the chessboard before I could even touch a pawn. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The house was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of heavy silence that makes your ears ring and your mind race. I walked over to the kitchen window and saw the light on in the back bedroom. Martha was still awake. I thought about knocking on her door, telling her it might be best to catch a bus back home before things got ugly. But I didn't, because in my gut, I knew she wouldn't leave, and because some small, stubborn part of me wanted her to stay. The next day, Sarah drove up to the ranch. She was a sharp young attorney Luke had recommended, with observant eyes and a briefcase overflowing with files. She sat on the porch, reviewed the notice, scribbled some notes, and then looked at me with a brutal honesty I wasn't expecting. "Mr. John, this is going to get dragged out, and while it's tied up in red tape, they have a window to make their move. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understood perfectly. Arthur didn't care about winning the land dispute. He cared about buying time. Time to do whatever he needed to do while my hands were legally tied. That very evening, the horse refused to eat for the first time since Martha had arrived. He stood dead center in the corral, ears pinned forward toward the tree line. Muscles coiled tight as a spring, listening to something none of us could hear. Martha tried to approach, but he skittered back. Alex patted the animal's neck and muttered, "This beast is spooked. He smells something coming." I stood there watching the horse for a long time, recalling something a grizzled old marshal had told me years ago. A horse won't ever lie to you. A horse just feels. I marched to the tool shed, grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I'd bought in town months ago for a repair job I never started, and headed straight for the woods. Martha trailed behind me up to the fence line but didn't cross. She just stood there in the dark, clutching her canvas bag with the notebook inside, watching me get swallowed by the trees. The brush was a lot thicker than I expected. Thick vines hung from the branches, and the ground was buried under a thick carpet of dead leaves that crunched like glass under my boots. I followed the landmarks I had burned into my memory from Michael's map, sweeping the flashlight beam to cut through the pitch black. It took me almost 40 minutes of bushwhacking to find it. It was an old, rusted wire fence, almost entirely devoured by the undergrowth, bearing a rotting wooden sign where I could barely make out Michael's family name, and just beneath it, a date that matched the exact year I had first set foot on this ranch as a young federal agent to investigate a massive land fraud case that had been mysteriously swept under the rug. I had been standing on this exact spot back then. I had looked at this land, and someone very powerful had made damn sure I didn't remember it. I had a house, breathing hard, my mind spinning with questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. Martha was still waiting by the fence. When I walked up, she didn't ask a single question. She just unzipped her bag, pulled out the notebook, and held it out to me. "There are more pages I haven't shown you," she said softly. "Michael knew you were going to need them." I cracked the notebook open right there under the pale moonlight. The subsequent pages were filled with a ledger of handwritten receipts, under the table cattle transfers between Arthur's family and a shady middleman, using the disputed strip of land as an off-the-books smuggling route. Receipts that Michael had hoarded because his gut told him they'd be a smoking gun someday. Receipts that proved not just the land theft, but the systematic decades-long extortion Arthur's family had waged against the working-class folks of this valley. "How in the hell did Michael get his hands on these?" I asked. "He worked for their outfit before he came to work for yours," Martha replied. "And when he realized what they were doing to people, he kept records of everything. He told me that one day somebody was going to need them." I stared at her, this frail woman who had trekked miles down a dusty highway, who had put her faith in a bitter stranger, who guarded a battered notebook like it was the Holy Grail, and it hit me like a freight train. Michael hadn't chosen this ranch by accident. He knew exactly who was living here. He knew my name, and he knew that sooner or later I was going to have to choose a side. The very next morning, David showed up. He was an old buddy from the badge, a guy I had bumped into at the county fair a few weeks prior and grabbed a casual beer with. But now he was standing on my back porch before dawn, knocking quietly, which meant he was off the clock and didn't want to leave a trail. "John," he said, keeping his voice low, "I'm on Arthur's payroll now, private security, and the boss just handed down an order to deal with the old lady problem once and for all." He paused, staring down at his boots. "I ain't gonna do it. I didn't drive out here to put hands on a grandma, but you've got until tomorrow morning before he sends a crew who will." Martha, who had been listening through the cracked kitchen window, slipped out the back door without making a sound, walked right at just one thing. "You knew Michael, didn't you?" David didn't say a word, and that silence was louder than a confession. After his taillights faded down the driveway, I sat heavily in a porch rocker, the notebook resting on my knees, watching the eastern sky turn bruised purple and orange. I had until tomorrow. 24 hours to decide if I was going to pin the star back on my chest, if I was going to risk my neck, if I was going to try to be the hero one last time, or if I was going to sit back and watch history repeat itself, watching the ruthless crush the innocent while silence buried the truth. Martha sat down in the rocker next to me, totally quiet. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, waiting. And I realized she already knew what I was going to do. Maybe she knew from the very first morning, the moment she saw me standing by the corral, watching her and that broken horse. I wasn't going to let them take her, not on my watch. I spent the entire night mapping out a battle plan, not with shotguns and a standoff, but with the arsenal I had mastered over years of federal investigations. A paper trail, sworn testimony, and the surgical use of a piece of evidence hiding in plain sight that everyone else had overlooked. The handwritten ledgers in Michael's book were the silver bullet. But papers alone wouldn't win this war. I needed the whole package: context, witnesses, an airtight narrative that the public couldn't ignore. And I had to move at lightning speed before David's countdown hit 0. I called Sarah at 6 in the morning. She answered groggily, but snapped to absolute attention the second I laid out the hand I was holding. "Mr. John, if what you're saying is verified, we aren't just looking at civil land disputes. This is an ongoing federal racketeering enterprise. I'm firing up my truck. I'll be there in an hour." While I waited, I walked down the hall to the back bedroom. Martha was already up, sitting on the edge of the mattress, hands resting gently on her knees. When I stepped into the doorway, she gave a small nod, like she knew exactly why I was there. "Did Michael write down anything about the men who ran with him?" I asked. "There's a manifest right in the middle of the book," she answered. "Dates, who moved what. He always said a ghost witness is no good to anybody." I flipped to the list. A dozen names. A few jumped out at me. Old-timers from the valley, folks who were still kicking around, punching clocks on neighboring ranches or retired in the dusty towns nearby. Michael had cataloged the entire operation: the cattle runners, the guys forging the brands, the bagmen, and at the very bottom, a scrawled note that made my blood run cold. Dad lost everything over a contract he couldn't read. Arthur did the exact same thing to 7 other families. When Sarah arrived, I threw the whole file on the table. She sat in dead silence for 20 minutes, flipping pages, furiously taking notes, connecting the dots. Finally, she looked up, her eyes blazing. "I need to scan every inch of this right now, and I need at least 3 living witnesses who will swear to this on the record. Do you know anyone on this list?" I knew 2. One was Paul, a tough old cowboy who had worked for my father-in-law back in the day, now running a small patch of dirt about 10 miles out. The other was Mary, a sweetheart of a woman who ran a rural preschool. According to Michael's notes, she was the daughter of one of the ranch hands Arthur had ruined. I saddled up my own gelding and rode out to Paul's place. The dirt road was rutted and rough, and the Texas sun was beating down hard by the time I hitched my horse. Paul was out back, wrestling with a fence stretcher, and when he saw me, he dropped his tools and walked to the gate. "John, been a long time." I gave it to him straight, showed him the pages Michael had bled over. Paul read them slowly, his lips moving silently over the words, and when he finished, he just stood there staring out at the scrub brush for an eternity. "I always figured Michael kept a stash," he grumbled. "Just assumed they burned it when he passed. Arthur is a venomous snake, John. You know that better than anyone." "I know, but if we don't chop the head off the snake today, he's going to keep biting." Paul looked me dead in the eye, then looked out toward the highway, where the heat waves were shimmering over the asphalt. "All right, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. But you gotta promise me one thing. Don't let them bury this again. Don't let them lock it in a filing cabinet like they did last time. I gave him my word, and it was a vow I'd die before breaking. Next, I rode over to the little schoolhouse where Mary taught. It was a faded white building with a rickety wooden playground out front and kids hollering in the yard. Mary was at the chalkboard, dusting off erasers, and when she spotted me in the doorway, she asked the kids to behave and stepped out onto the porch. I laid out the whole ugly truth. Let her hold the notebook, and when I mentioned her father's name, her eyes pooled with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. "My daddy went to his grave thinking he'd disgraced us," she said, her voice shaking but full of steel. "He thought he lost our legacy because he was uneducated, because he couldn't read the fine print, because he was careless. We grew up carrying his shame. I'll testify, John. I'll shout it from the rooftops." I rode back to my ranch with 2 ironclad signatures and a fire in my gut. We had them dead to rights. Sarah was camped out on the porch, her laptop glowing, frantically scanning the last of the pages. Alex had brought out a pot of black coffee and some biscuits, and Martha was quietly rocking in the porch chair, taking it all in. "We're missing the final nail," Sarah said, typing furiously. "We have to blow this up in the press before we file the federal injunction. If we march straight to the courthouse, Arthur will pull his strings and make it disappear before the ink dries. But if it's the top story on the evening news, he can't hide in the shadows." "You got a guy in the press?" I asked. "I've got a bulldog reporter who's been covering the county for 2 years. He's been trying to expose this land grab ring forever, but never had the paper trail. We hand him this. He'll run with it." She dialed him on the spot, pitched the story, emailed the encrypted scans, and 30 minutes later we had the green light. They were breaking the story at 5 o'clock on the regional news site and blasting it across the local radio waves. I leaned against the porch railing, looking down at the corral where the skinny horse was standing perfectly still, calmly chewing the hay Martha had tossed in the trough. I thought about Michael, about the massive secret he had carried, about how many years those pages had sat in the dark waiting for a spark, and I thought about all the good people who had been bulldozed, who had lost their livelihoods because a man with a fat wallet and a cruel heart decided he was above the law. At 5 p.m. sharp, the story broke. Sarah put her phone on speaker so we could all listen to the broadcast. The reporter read the ledgers on air, played audio clips of Paul and Mary, and laid out the devastating history of the valley's land corruption. And right at the climax, he named Arthur, his entire empire, and the fraudulent land dispute he was currently pushing. Less than half an hour later, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was the county clerk's office calling to confirm that a federal judge, who had caught the broadcast, had placed an immediate emergency freeze on Arthur's injunction. Arthur, who had strutted into town hall that morning, acting like he owned the place, was forced to scurry out the back alley to avoid a rapidly growing crowd of locals, many of them the sons and daughters of the men he had ruined, who were waiting out front with hastily painted signs and glaring cell phone cameras. Word traveled faster than a prairie fire. Luke called to say hell yeah. Alex walked up to the porch with a grin that split his weathered face. And Martha, who hadn't left the rocking chair all afternoon, simply closed her eyes and whispered something into the wind that sounded an awful lot like a prayer of thanks. Later that night, long after the dust had settled and the ranch had fallen back into its familiar, peaceful silence, I walked down to the corral. The horse was standing right by the fence, his ribs already looking a little less jagged after weeks of love and good feed. I reached over, rested my hand on his strong neck, feeling the steady heat of his body and the coarse hair under my palm. "You led her right to my door, didn't you, boy?" I whispered. "You knew the way." The horse let out a soft snort, nuzzling my hand as if to say yes, and I just stood there under the Texas stars, overwhelmed by a feeling I thought I'd lost forever. The wild, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, some things in this broken world can actually be fixed. The next few weeks brought a profound, eerie peace, the kind of quiet that washes over the plains after a massive thunderstorm. When the wind dies, the dust settles, and the air smells too clean to be real. Arthur vanished into thin air. No phone calls, no threats, no slick lawyers trying to appeal. The temporary freeze on the land grab became permanent after the U.S. Attorney's Office launched a massive federal RICO probe based entirely on the dossier Sarah had handed over. The same weaponized silence Arthur had used to terrorize people was now completely suffocating him. Martha kept tending to the horse. Every single morning before the sun peaked over the horizon, she'd walk down to the pens with a fresh flake of hay, murmuring softly to the gelding, stroking his neck with a tenderness that seemed to heal wounds much deeper than skin and bone. I'd watch them from the kitchen window, nursing my black coffee, marveling at how a 72-year-old woman who had buried her boy. I'd watch them from the kitchen window, nursing my black coffee, marveling at how a 72-year-old woman who had buried her boy and walked miles down a lonely highway possessed more sheer grit and strength than I ever did. By the fourth week, Paul drove up the driveway grinning ear to ear. The federal judge had officially ordered the disputed strip of land permanently deeded back to my ranch, ruling that Arthur's claim was entirely fraudulent. But the real victory was bigger. 3 families who had been robbed of their generational land, including by the feds, to begin restitution proceedings. The battered notebook Michael had left behind hadn't just saved his mother. It had blown the doors off a vault everyone thought was welded shut for good. "You did the right thing, John," Paul said, gripping my hand with calloused fingers. "Michael would be damn proud." After he pulled out, I stood on the porch, staring out across the expanse. The valley was lush and green for this time of year, buzzing with life, the sound of meadowlarks carrying on the breeze. And for the first time in 4 agonizing years, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. Not because the ranch was bustling with people, it wasn't, but because I had finally done something that mattered, something bigger than my own pity, bigger than my grief, bigger than the shadows of my past. Later that afternoon, Martha came downstairs holding the leather notebook. She sat down beside me on the porch swing, letting the silence stretch as we watched the wind rustle the cottonwood leaves. Then, with trembling hands, she flipped to the very last page, and it was a letter, penned in the same meticulous handwriting that filled the ledgers and the manifest, and it started like this: "To whoever finds this book." I read the whole thing, holding my breath. Michael laid it all out. How he had stumbled onto the corruption, how he had meticulously built the paper trail, how he knew the day of reckoning would eventually come. But it was the final paragraph that knocked the wind out of me. "If you are reading this, it means my mother made it to John's ranch. He won't remember me, because I was just a little kid when he came to our valley investigating the case that ultimately broke my father. But I remember him. I remember the way he looked people in the eye, the way he actually listened, the way he seemed to genuinely believe that justice still existed in this world. He turned in his badge because the system betrayed him. But I always knew that, if he was given the chance, he would step up and do the right thing again. Please, take care of my mother, and take care of the horse. They both know the way home." I closed the notebook slowly, my hands shaking uncontrollably, a heavy lump threatening to choke me. I looked over at Martha and saw tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, making no effort to wipe them away. "He knew," I rasped, my voice cracking. "From the very beginning, he knew." "He always knew," Martha whispered back. "He spent 20 years waiting for the perfect moment, and when he felt his own time running out, he set the board, because he trusted you with his legacy." I was completely speechless. There were no words for a moment like this. A kid I had crossed paths with exactly once, decades ago. During a bust, I had tried to drink away and forget. had held onto my memory like a sacred oath. He had believed in my integrity when I didn't even believe in it myself. And he had orchestrated a master plan that completely relied on me doing exactly what I just did. Not out of duty, not to play the hero, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That evening, I walked down to the corral one last time before Martha was set to leave. She had decided to move back to her hometown now that the dust had settled and her son's righteous crusade was finally complete. But before she left, there was one last piece of business to take care of. "What are you going to call him?" I asked, looking at the gelding, who was now filling out, his coat catching the silver moonlight, his eyes steady and calm. Martha smiled, gently rubbing the horse's muzzle, and said, "Michael already picked a name. It's on the back of the very last page, right behind the letter. I just needed to make absolutely sure I was handing him over to the right man." I took the notebook, flipped past the letter, and read the single word Michael had written in bold, deliberate ink. It wasn't just any name. It was my last name. The exact same name that was carved into that rotting sign out in the woods. The name I had worn like a badge of honor when I was a federal agent. The name I had tried to bury in the dirt when I gave up on the world. I looked at Martha, completely bewildered. Why on earth would he name the horse after me? She reached out, took my hand, squeezed it tight, and said, "Because you saved my husband's life during that raid 23 years ago. You might have forgotten, but he never did. And when Michael was born, his daddy told him that if he ever had to trust a man with his life, it would be you. That's why he left the book. That's why he left the horse. And that's why he sent me to your door. He knew you wouldn't let me stand alone. He knew you were still a good man, even when you convinced yourself you weren't." I stood paralyzed in the dirt, clutching the notebook, feeling the crushing weight of 23 years wash over me like a sudden rain. Memories I had aggressively suppressed came flooding back. A terrified ranch hand I had pulled from a deadly crossfire, a vulnerable family I had shielded when the brass wanted to use them as collateral damage, a scrawny little boy who had hugged my leg before I drove away and promised he'd pay me back someday. I hadn't just saved a family that day. I had planted a seed that grew quietly in the dark for over 2 decades. And now, when I was at my absolute lowest, when I was convinced I had nothing left to give the world, that seed had blossomed into salvation. Martha packed up and left the next morning. Luke pulled his truck around to give her a ride, and she climbed in with her canvas tote on her lap and a serene, beautiful smile on her face. Before she closed the door, she gave me a fierce hug and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, and thank you for not giving up on yourself." I stood on the porch and watched the taillights disappear into the lingering dust. Alex ambled up the steps, clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, and said, "Boss, I think your horse is looking for you." I walked down to the corral. The big gelding was standing dead center, waiting for me. I stepped up slowly, held out my hand, and he pressed